Okay, Lesson 20, Global Issues. This is Chapter 25, Section 4, for Government. So, global issues. Global issues require international cooperation, and issues today include terrorism, nuclear proliferation, which means the spread of nuclear weapons, human rights promotion, and protection of the environment. The reason why these things require international cooperation, global issues, is because since they're global problems, more than one nation is going to have to deal with it. International terrorism is the use of violence by non-governmental groups against civilians for political goals. And since World War II, most terrorist attacks have been directed against the U.S. from Middle Eastern groups. Why? Because of United States support of the Middle Eastern oil industry, and also because of American support for Israel. And if you look at this map here of the world, the darker the color, the more terrorist incidents that have been reported in the last couple of decades or so. And this picture to the left shows you a bombing attack, a terrorist bombing back in the 20s. So the only reason I put that in there is basically I wanted you to understand that terrorism is not a new thing. It's been around for a while. State-sponsored terrorism. In the 1970s, several Middle Eastern states began to support terrorism with money, facilities, and training. And some of these countries include Libya, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. And the picture shows you what's left of the Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie, where a Libyan-supported terrorist put a bomb on a plane, and to the right you see the grave of someone who passed away in that bombing. Another thing your textbook talks about is Osama bin Laden, of course the mastermind behind Al-Qaeda, the leader whose lieutenants came up with the World Trade Center plot. He founded Al-Qaeda in 1988. He had been working, he's a wealthy Saudi Muslim terrorist. He founded Al-Qaeda in 1988. He used training that he had received when he helped fight the Soviet Union in their invasion of Afghanistan. He believed Western ideas were corrupting the Muslim world, which is the Ummah. Ummah means basically the Muslim world, the community of all Muslims. And he believed the West could be beaten. And so, to the top right, of course, the scene of the World Trade Center after it had been hit by planes, and a picture in the bottom right of Osama bin Laden smiling. And then the bottom picture to the left is American propaganda in Afghanistan, to kind of get across the idea that these guys, these Al-Qaeda leaders, are deadly, lethal, and not in a good way, if there is a good way to be deadly and lethal. So the attacks of Al-Qaeda, they attacked throughout the 1990s. They bombed U.S. ships, and they even bombed the World Trade Center before September 11th, 2001. They had been less successful. They planted explosives in a car in a parking garage. It did some damage, but not enough damage to raise alarms and cause the United States to really react strongly and decisively about Al-Qaeda and terrorism. September 11th, 2001, they hijacked planes, ran them into the World Trade Center, and one into the Pentagon. Another plane didn't make any of its targets because people on board the plane, using their cell phones, discovered what had happened with the other planes, realized that their hijacked plane wasn't going to be used to make a trade for political prisoners or something like that, that it was going to be used as a weapon. And as a result, they decided to take the plane over and got close to succeeding from what we can understand from the recordings, but the terrorist pilot ran the plane into the ground. rather than lose control of the plane. The American response to 9/11 was the war on terrorism, the war on global terrorism. So this war was against, in the case of Afghanistan, the war was against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan early on. We bombed Afghanistan in October of 2011, so within a month of the terrorist attack at World Trade Center. This was not a war against Islam or the Afghan people, but the Taliban, who were in charge of large portions of Afghanistan and who we really didn't recognize as a legitimate government, and they were providing protection for Al-Qaeda. When we demanded that they turn over Al-Qaeda leaders to us, they refused, and that's why we began bombing them. And then it expanded into the war against Saddam Hussein in Iraq. There's a great deal more controversy about whether or not it should have. But suffice it to say, as far as fact goes, we did fight a war against Saddam Hussein in Iraq. He eventually was hiding out, and we see a picture here of our military men having found and captured Saddam Hussein, who was later on executed by his people. So now the nuclear weapons threat. Nuclear proliferation. Proliferation means the spread of. So the spread of nuclear weapons. In 1968, a bunch of countries signed a non-proliferation treaty and agreed that they will not give nuclear weapons technology to other nations, they will ensure the safe use of nuclear power, and they will encourage the disarmament and destruction, I misspelled destruction for some reason, probably too sleepy, the destruction of existing nuclear weapons. So UN sanctions against building nuclear weapons. It's now possible to build nuclear weapons cheaper with more readily available substances. So as a result, there's a great deal more concern that more nations will gain nuclear weapons, that maybe terrorist groups will get a hold of these weapons. The UN doesn't like the idea of more countries with nuclear weapons. It's just simple math. The more countries you have with nuclear weapons, the more people get to decide whether or not to use them, and that means the more likely one of those people will say, yes, let's go ahead and use nuclear weapons, and then you have nuclear war. And if you look at this map, it shows countries that have long had nuclear weapons, recently attained nuclear weapons, or are working on nuclear weapons, or are suspected of having them. So the places that have some sort of color have some sort of connection with the spread of nuclear weapons. So the areas of greatest concern are North Korea, Iran, and this concern is especially due to the practice of state-sponsored terrorism. Both North Korea and Iran like to sponsor terrorism, so the idea of them getting a hold of nukes really freaks us out. The U.S., Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and Russia have all pledged to spend $20 billion over the next 10 years on non-proliferation. Sounds like a lot of money, but really in the scheme of things, it's not really that much when you consider how large, say, the U.S. economy is. So now we get to human rights. These are basic freedoms all people should enjoy regardless of their age, gender, nationality, or ethnicity. In 1948, there was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It was signed by member nations in the UN. It guarantees political and civil rights, the right to asylum. In case you're in an oppressive government, you get away from it and they're trying to do horrible things to you, you should be able to get protection in another country. The right to marry, the right to own property, and these are denials of government power, the things the government shouldn't be able to stop you from being able to do. And then there are economic, social, and cultural rights. Equal pay for equal work, the right to an education, these are positive rights, things the government should do for you, is the argument. So, some of the organizations that deal with human rights violations, you have the UN Security Commission on Human Rights, which monitors and reports human rights violations. You have the UN's International Criminal Tribunals, temporary courts to prosecute human rights violators. And the European Union has the European Convention of Human Rights, And this applies to all European Union countries. So they have this list of rights that they're all supposed to guarantee. The picture is of a fellow named Slobodan Milosevic, a Serbian leader who was on trial for committing human rights violations in the genocides that the Serbian government enacted during conflict in the Balkans back in the early 90s and a little bit later. He died of a heart attack before he was convicted. So the Permanent International Criminal Court was established in 2002, the ICC, for human rights violations and war crimes. The United States has refused to sign on to it because of concern about frivolous complaints of U.S. war crimes. We're already accused of quite a few things that we don't find to be credible, so that's why we want to avoid this. It's also an issue of U.S. sovereignty. But for example, the daughter of Muammar Gaddafi, that we bombed Libya back in the 80s, and the Libyans claimed that one of his baby daughter had been killed in the bombings. It turns out now that Libya has been essentially freed from Muammar Gaddafi, it's in the early stages of reforming. Protecting the environment. Now the problems of the environment are exploding population growth and an increasing consumption of natural resources as not only a result of this increasing population, but also because of technology changes and the spread of the middle class lifestyle, if you will, around the world. There's also the growing discharge of pollution globally. The core dilemma in dealing with the environment is balancing economic development with protection of the environment. So this is a big kind of issue here, and the term for this is sustained development, a key term for understanding this issue. Sustained development. I didn't write it down in the slide, but sustained development is something you'd want in your notes if you don't already have it. And here we see some, polluting smokestacks, and then a book written about expanding population bomb by Dr. Paul Ehrlich. So developed nations like the United States find it easier to make industry more efficient, which means it's less damaging to the environment, and also as a result of it being easier, it means it's not too hard economically to bear the burden of these changes. However, developing nations have a much greater focus on economic growth. They don't want to slow things down by having scrubbers in their smokestacks. They want to get things done, raise some money. So industrial pollution, while it's a problem for everybody, developing nations are less sensitive to it because of the desperate need to increase their economic health. International conferences and treaties that have tried to deal with the pollution. The 1992 UN Earth Summit, which established the Biodiversity Treaty to conserve ecosystems and natural habitats. Remember biomes and things like that in biology. So ecosystems. In 1997, the Kyoto Protocol, which reduces greenhouse emissions. The U.S. signed the protocol then in 1999, voted against implementing it because of concern over the effects it would have on the American economy. There was also concerns about whether or not it was fair. Some developing countries were getting some breaks that the U.S. wouldn't be getting in implementing the Kyoto Protocol. And the U.S. government has to balance its global leadership with its own economic needs, and frankly, the public will. The attitude of the public, whether or not we would support the decision to sign a Kyoto Protocol and follow through with it or not.